right, y'all, here we go. Math lesson from chapter 9, the first lesson from chapter 9, dependent and independent variables. So those are kind of bigger words that we don't use a lot in math. We, of course, use variables. We've figured out what variables are, and we know that they are that letter that represents a value, and that value could change, right? That value could stand for anything. That's why they just put a letter there instead of just one number. Okay, so now we got to figure out what independent and dependent means. So let's think a minute. Where have you heard the word independent? Let me give you some clues. So if you're independent, you can tie your own shoelace, right? You don't need your mom to tie your shoe anymore. Some of you, I notice you still use Velcro. But for the most part, when you can tie your own shoe, you're independent. You don't need your parents helping you with shoes anymore. You're kind of free, like these birds here. If you're independent, you don't rely on anyone, you can do it yourself. When you grow up, you become an adult, you're independent. You don't rely on anyone. You can get your own groceries, you have your own job, you have your own car. You're independent, you don't need help from anyone. So that's what independent means. Now, what about dependent? Thinking the opposite, aren't you? Right? If you're dependent on someone, you depend on someone else. That's where the depend right there comes from. So of course, if you do need to tie your shoes, then you're dependent on someone to tie your shoes for you so you don't trip and fall. Babies are very, very dependent on any adult really to feed them, to clothe them, to change their dirty diaper. They're dependent individuals. Okay, if you're in a cage or anything like that, you're dependent on someone to feed you because you're trapped. So that's what dependent is. And they have those variables are that way. You're going to have an independent and a dependent variable. And that's what we're going to figure out today. That's what we're going to talk about. So let me give you just a quick rundown. Independent variables are like independent people. They can stand alone. They can change. They can do kind of whatever they want. Whereas a dependent variable cannot stand alone. A dependent variable, just like a dependent child, depends on whatever the independent variable is. Okay, it's often the total after all the work has been done, after all the other variables have done what they do, then the dependent variable happens. Okay, so it depends. What I want you to remember is the dependent variable depends on what the independent variable is. Let me give you an example of that. So Jerry burns 5.8 calories for every minute she jogs. Write an equation to represent the relationship between the number of minutes Jerry jogs, M for minutes, and the total number of calories, C, she burns. So we can think of that variable, or that equation, as being, 5.8 calories for every minute she jogs. And we know for every minute, that's the same as for each. So we know we got some multiplication there. Then we don't know how many minutes she jogs, so that's why we're going to use the variable M. So then what we end up with is maybe, come on mouse, 5.8 M, right? Those are being times together. And then after that, you'll get the number of calories because it's 5.8 calories for every minute. Okay, so there's our equation. Now we have two variables there. We have an M and we have a C. M stands for minutes, C stands for calories. One of those is independent, one of those is dependent. So what you got to think today is which one depends on the other one to know what it is. And in this example, Jerry won't know how many calories she's burned until what? Until she knows how many minutes she's ran, right? So the amount of calories she's burned depends, on how many minutes she ran. If she didn't run any minutes, she didn't lose any calories. If she ran a lot of minutes, she lost a lot of calories. Therefore, the C is the dependent variable because the number of calories burned depends on how many minutes she's ran. That's just the first example. Does that make sense? So the big idea I want you to talk about, or the big idea I want you to remember today, is that the independent variable determines the value of the dependent one. So in your notes right here, I want you to write the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. Write that down. That is the most important thing. The dependent variable depends on what the independent variable is. Okay? So these are the kind of two things I want you to talk about today. I want you to say, whenever you're trying to decide whether it's dependent or independent, I want you to be able to say this, okay? So in our example, calories is the dependent variable because it depends on the amount of minutes to know the answer, okay? Or you could say down here, calories is dependent because we can't figure out how many calories until we know how many minutes she's ran. So I put this big and bold in your notes so that you could come back to it and say it and see if the sentences make sense when you're trying to figure out. Okay, let's go on to our next one. Lorelei is spending the afternoon bowling. This is in your notes too, so I want you to be writing it along with me. Lorelei is spending the afternoon bowling with her friends. Each game she plays costs $3.25, and there is a one-time shoe rental fee of $2.50. So how could you write that equation? That's what we're going to start with so that we can know what variables to use. Each game costs $3.25. So let's go $3.25, but it's each game. So let's make sure that we show that it will change depending on how many games she's played. Then, and, remember, and means plus, and there is a one-time shoe rental of $2.50. So then we need to plus the $2.50. Okay, so here's our equation. Now, and then we have our, what should we do for our total? T. Okay, so we've got a G for the number of games and a T for the total price. We've got our equation. Now we've got to figure out which one is independent and which one is dependent. So let me rewrite that equation again. It's 325G plus, and if you don't have this written down, you will be writing it down with me right now, 250 equals T for total. So we've got a G and a T. We got to ask ourselves, is games independent or dependent? Is the total independent or dependent? So let's think about this. Let's look over here as well to see what would make sense. Which variable is dependent on the other one? Which one can't we figure out unless we know what the other variable is? Okay, so the way that I think of it is the total, and this is a hint for you. Oftentimes the total is your dependent variable because we can't figure out the total until we know everything else that's been going on. And that's true in this instance because we won't know our total until we know how many games Lorelei has played. If she's only played one game, then it's just going to be 325. But if she's played 2 games, then it'll be 325 times 2, which will change your total. So every time your independent variable changes, well, that's going to change your dependent variable. So in this case, over here, the way we would say it is the total, the T, is the dependent variable because it depends on the number of games to know the answer. Okay, the total amount is dependent because we can't figure it out until we know how many games Lorelei has played. So that is why you're going to put a T here and a G here. Your total is dependent on the number of games played. That making sense?